hearts ready to receive what the Lord Jesus would give to us. So it is mealtime. And goodness knows a lot of us love to eat, so may we approach the Word with the same kind of heart hunger this morning. Well, a set of twins from Ohio who were separated at birth grew up without any knowledge of each other's existence. Their lives did, however, share a strange number of similarities. They were both named James at their adoptions. They both grew up to be police officers. And they both married women named Linda. But that's not all. Each of them had a son. One named James Allen, A-L-L-A-N, and the other named James Allen, A-L-A-N. Each also had a dog named Toy. Both brothers later got divorced and ended up both remarrying women named Betty. I am not making this up. True story. Now let me ask you something. Do you believe in coincidence? Good, because I don't either. There's no such thing as coincidence for people who inhabit the kingdom of God. Our Father is sovereign. He is in control of all things, both large and small, and He is ushering the river of history toward His appointed end, and at every step along the way, He is in complete control. Now that deserves an amen. This morning we're in Esther chapter 6. And Esther chapter 6 is the pivot point of the entire book. In fact, I've given you a visual this morning. I hope you got one of those on your way in. That will help you see this. Okay, I've told you before, I'm a very visual learner. And so walking through the passage this week, I felt like it was good for me, and it might be good for some of y'all, that I put together something to help you see how this is kind of where things begin to turn around in the book. The structure of the book of Esther, okay, is an interesting structure. There's something in Hebrew literature called a chiasm, right? C-H-I-A-S-M. And chiasms are structured according to like parallels. And you most often see it in Hebrew poetry. But the entire book of Esther is one large chiasm. So chapter 1 corresponds to the end of the book and so on. So that the events leading to the culmination of the book in chapter 6 kind of drive you to this midpoint. And the middle of the structure tells you and I what the meaning of the book is. So that we then are to interpret everything that happens in the book according to this kind of climax that happens in chapter 6. And the climax of the book ultimately tells you and me who the hero of the story is. All right? Let me give you a clue. It's not a queen with a crown, nor is it her cousin. Now, we talked about this at the beginning, but it's going to become really, really clear today. So Esther chapter 6, we're going to launch into verse 1, and we're going to read part of the chapter, we're going to talk about it, and then we will read the rest and kind of summarize things today. Esther chapter 6, verse 1. On that night, the king could not sleep. Now, what night are we talking about? Okay, let's go ahead and walk back a few verses and pick up the context. Okay, so Esther has gotten up the courage to go before the king and to plead on behalf of her people for the lives of her people. Well, she's a very wise woman, so she knows how to actually manipulate such a negative word. But see, she's so shrewd and she knows the king so well that she knows how to pull his heartstrings a little bit, okay? So she has this feast for him. They're drinking wine. The king says, Esther, okay, so what's your request? What do you want? she says, well, if I found favor in your sight, meaning if you are disposed to give me anything I want, then come to a feast tomorrow, and I'll tell you then. Now, very, very astutely, okay, she's already setting things up to where when she gives him her request the next day, he's going to what? He's kind of forced to answer it. He's forced to give her whatever she wants. So she's very wise. She's very smart. Well, that night, verse 1 of chapter 6 tells us that the king can't sleep. Now, I'm going to argue that's the most important book, and that's the most important verse in the whole book of Esther. Okay? And you'll see why in just a minute. And on that night the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, and who had sought to lay hands on the king. And the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? The king's young men who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. And the king said, well, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, well, Haman's here, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, who would the king delight to honor more than me? Fantastic. Don't you just love the setup? I do. I love it. It's fantastic. But here's what I want you to see, okay? This chapter reveals to us who's really in control in this story. And precious saints this morning, you need to remember this, okay? And it's my prayer that as we dig into this, that it'll get into your heart and roots will develop there and you'll begin to see God in control in every single area of your life, large and small. Now, in these first several verses, there are several just so happens, okay? Think about it. It just so happens that the king cannot sleep on this particular night. Coincidence? Maybe. If there were just one coincidence in this passage. But what does the king request? The king gave orders to bring the book of the memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. This is the equivalent of the phone book, okay? The king said, bring the book of the memorable deeds and read it so that I can try to go to sleep. Boring. But it just so happens that the attendant flips to the exact page and begins to read about Mordecai's deed to save the life of the king, which occurred 5 years prior. Well, coincidence? They're starting to stack up. They're starting to stack up. Now, while the king is hearing this, the king goes, wait a minute, what was ever done for Mordecai? Well, you see, the Persian kings were not only methodical about recording the memorable deeds of themselves and people in their kingdom, but they were methodical about rewarding people for those deeds. That's how you keep people loyal. Okay? By remembering their deeds, pointing them out, and rewarding them for those things. So the king takes note in his sleeplessness that nothing was recorded, nothing was done to honor Mordecai. And so, verse 3. And the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And of course the king's young men who attended him said, nothing's been done for it. And then the king said, who is in the court? Now the king immediately grabs hold of this and thinks, in the middle of the night, something needs to be done right now to reward Mordecai. Not another day can go by, but this needs to be taken care of. So he's like, okay, who's here? It just so happens that Mordecai, that Haman has been up all night too. Haman you remember, went home after the first feast, filled with joy, filled with delight. He had an in with the king and the queen that nobody had. He got home. He was all happy with the exception of one thing. There was one thing he didn't have. Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. And then his wife, what a treasure she was. She gets a big, bright idea. She says, well, just kill him. That's what it says. Just take him out. And so he goes, that is a great idea. So he has his servants build a wooden stake 75 feet tall in his backyard with a pointed end on it. And here he goes out into the middle of the night all excited to go talk to the king about executing Mordecai. So here he is. I imagine Haman. He's like out in the courtyard, man. He's pacing. He knows he might not get to see the king until the sun comes up. But here comes one of his servants. Haman, come in here. Come in here. The king wants to see you. Now, this point, right, Haman is so incredibly excited. Verse 5. And the king's young men told him, Haman is here, standing in the court, and the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, now listen. The king fails to mention the name of the man that he wants to honor. What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And of course, Haman, being incredibly, completely, totally full of himself, says to himself, well, who would the king delight to honor more than me? Now, all of these coincidences, all of these things that happen cannot possibly be mere coincidence. That's why this is the pivot point of the book. This shows us that while Esther was sleeping and Mordecai were sleeping, the real hero of the book is going into action to rescue and deliver his people. It ain't them. He's going to use them, but guess what? He doesn't need them. He doesn't need them. God is the real hero of the book who works while the world sleeps. Do you believe that? Amen. He works while the world sleeps. He works through the most mundane moments, including a king's insomnia, to bring about the very best of outcomes for his people. Y'all, this is Romans 8, 28 through 30 in action. Okay? Turn over there with me. And if you highlight in your Bible, if you write in your Bible, if you underline in your Bible, draw a big circle around Romans 8, 28 through 30, and write Esther 6 out to the side, okay? It is an incredible illustration of these verses in action. Paul writes, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. How many things? All. How many? All. How many? All things. Those things great and those things small. Those things disastrous and those things that fill up the details of our everyday lives. How many things? All things. All things work together for good. For those who are called according to God's purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. Translation, no one can thwart God's plans. When God sets his affection on a people, no one can thwart God's love for them or interrupt God's plans and purposes for them. Okay? Not even a Persian dictator on a sleepless night. Y'all, this is God working sleepless nights together for those who love him. Not only the king's, but perhaps yours. This is God working seemingly accidental occurrences for the good of those who belong to Him. This is God working the slights of others and perhaps years-old wounds and disappointments for the good of those who belong to Him. How do you think Mordecai felt about being slighted, about not being rewarded for what he had done for the king? Perhaps it was a disappointment that he had long since laid to rest. We don't know. Y'all, this is God working the worst possible things that you and I can face to the good of those who belong to Him. This is God even working the bad decisions that we regret and the foolish choices that we've made to the good of those who belong to Him. This is God in the book of Esther, here in chapter 6, working the most mundane, forgettable, and everyday events of our lives to the good of those who belong to Him. I love how R.C. Sproul said it when he was alive. While the popular adage declares that the devil is in the details, it's more accurate to say that God is in the details. The doctrine of providence declares that God's providential rule extends to all things great and small, from the huge to the minute, from the infinite to the infinitesimal. Y'all, this is the God who wastes nothing. Now, there's been a song over the last several years that's helped me in those moments when I have tended to forget this. And I want you to listen to this. Is the video ready back there, guys? Fantastic.
The hurt that broke your heart and left you trembling in the dark, feeling lost and alone. Will tell your hopes a lie, but what if every tear you cry will seed the ground where joy will grow? Nothing's wasted in the hands of our Redeemer. Nothing's wasted. It's from the deepest wounds that beauty finds a place to bloom, and you will see before the end that every broken piece is gathered in the heart of Jesus, and what's lost will be found again. Nothing's wasted, nothing's wasted in the hands of our Redeemer. Nothing's wasted. When hope is more than you can bear, and it's too hard to believe it could be true, and your strength fails you halfway there, you can lean on me and I'll believe for you. And in time, you will believe it too. Nothing's wasted. Nothing's wasted. Sometimes we are waiting in the sorrow we've tasted, but joy will replace it. Nothing's wasted in the hands of our Redeemer. Nothing's wasted.
That doesn't mean that everything that happens to us is good. That's not what Paul's saying in Romans 8:28. Okay? What he is saying is that God can bring good out of any and all things that happen to us.
Amen.
Now that's remarkable. That is incredibly, incredibly remarkable. Think about the story of Joseph, right? Esther's not the only place where we see this. Joseph, who took what his brothers meant for evil, selling him into slavery, and ended up using it to provide for his people during a time of severe famine. Well, this is the God of Ruth, who took the tragic family losses that Naomi endured and used them to orchestrate a chance meeting between Ruth and Boaz and the eventual marriage that would lead to the birth of King David's grandfather. Right? Like, this is the God of Joseph and Mary, whose baby boy was born in an insignificant place to insignificant parents on a night when the rest of the world slept, completely unaware of the fact that the King of creation had just stepped on the stage. This is the God who sovereignly accomplished salvation for the world through the single most horrendous and evil act in the history of the world. Acts chapter 4, verses 27 and 28, the church gathered there is praying, and these are their words: "For truly in this city we're gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, excuse me, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place." Well, that is a mystery wrapped in an enigma. The fact that evil people executed the sinless Son of God, but within the divine overarching plan of redemption, that was God's will all along. Can anybody here figure that out? No. You know what our response is meant to be? Worship.
Amen.
Worship. That the wisdom and the riches and the knowledge of God are far beyond our understanding. Y'all, this is the God who works through the daily decisions and actions and reactions of every human being on the planet, who are free to do as they choose, but whose choices will always, somehow, some way, fit into God's plan. Mind-blowing. This is the God who takes all the seemingly pointless and insignificant threads and weaves them into a tapestry of grace that will be so astoundingly beautiful when you and I see the finished product that the only thing you'll be able to do is wonder and worship. Like you and I, we just get threads now. We just get threads. We just get to see the tapestry from behind. And we can't always, and I can't promise you that in this life you'll be able to make sense of the hard things you go through. Sometimes you won't. Sometimes you'll ask for answers and you will not get them. Maybe that's not what you wanted to hear today. But it's true. You know what you get instead? You get a Jesus who's enough.
Grace.
And you get grace to sustain you.
Amen.
And you get to know that one day, when you stand in His presence, He'll flip it around and you'll go, "Oh, I understand. God, you're amazing. I could never have done this on my own." Y'all, that's what the book of Esther calls us to. It calls us to live as if God is at work, really at work, all the time. In all of the unfolding events of our lives, even when we can't see exactly what He's doing, even when we're asleep or when we're having sleepless nights. In fact, the whole book of Esther invites us to consider these things by bringing the book to a climax in chapter 6, the author invites all of us to consider the many, many ways that God's at work in our lives and in our world, even though things may seem otherwise to us. This is why Esther is such an incredibly valuable book. But the book of Esther also teaches us to wait on the Lord. To wait on the Lord to bring about His good purposes for us. How many of you have ever gotten ahead of the Lord? Woo! Me? Abraham did, didn't he? Man, it cost him. It cost him big time. Y'all, the book of Esther reminds us. It reminds us in chapter 6, after Esther has started this plan into motion, and even while she sleeps, that God's the one who's going to turn it all around. The book of Esther reminds us that in God's time, He will do that. Did you realize that God is rarely early? He's rarely early. How many of you have been at the 11th hour at 11:59 and you have been pouring your heart out before the Lord, going, God, you have got to do something. I'm out of solutions. I'm at dead ends. There's nothing more I can do here. You know what God often does in those moments? He says, that's what I was waiting for you to say. God's rarely early, but you know what? He's never late. Ever. He's always, always, always in control. So to the children of God, chapter 6 of the book of Esther says, remember, your Father's in control. But notice what else chapter 6 says. Chapter 6 also says to the proud trying to plot their own course, remember, because you need to remember too. God really is in control. Look with me back at chapter 6, okay? Let's get ready for the poetic justice to unfold. Chapter 6, verse 6. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman said to the king. Now Haman's thinking completely and totally of himself here. So what would he want? He goes, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set, and let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Let's stop right there, okay? Oh, it's coming, y'all, feel it. It's coming, it's about to turn around.
There goes pride.
Haman is the second most powerful person in the Persian kingdom. So he's not lacking for much, but there is one thing he's lacking. There is one position he doesn't have. What is it? To be king. So if he can't have the office, he's sure going to parade himself around like he can, wearing the robes, the crown, and riding the horse. Verse 10. Look, y'all, I've got it highlighted. I've got a circle around it in my book. Like, here we go. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew. Who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing you have mentioned. Oh man, this is so good. Verse 11. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him. Now I gotta read this like I picture him saying this. Thus shall it be done to the one that the king delights to honor. Just through gritted teeth, right? Like, verse 12. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman hurried to his house mourning and with his head covered. Wow, what a change. What a difference. Not even 24 hours before, here was a man on top of the world. Here was a man who thought that he could do anything he wanted. What did God do? God said, God put a stop to that. And so he goes home this time not proud and not delighted, but shamed. And look at what happens. His wife's always got good news for him, by the way, right? Verse 13, and Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men, his wife Zeresh, said to him, well, if Mordecai, before whom you've begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you're not going to be able to overcome him, but you're surely going to fall before him. Fantastic. Welcome home. I've got great news for you. Man, exactly. Wow. The whole point of this second part of chapter 6 is that we would remember that God is in control, and that ultimately that pride would be laid at his feet. You see, it's the point this chapter is, where God ultimately shows the emptiness of pride for what it is. This is the point where the plot to destroy his people is exposed for what it is, and God again says, ain't happening. I ain't going to let nobody eliminate my people from the face of the earth. Haman thought that he was coming to the palace to ask the king's permission to execute Mordecai. Instead, he ends up participating in the exaltation of Mordecai. And as we're going to see next week, things just go downhill from there for Haman. Okay, I'm not going to spoil it. But you're welcome to read ahead. You got your Bible, you know the whole story. The point is this: God's in control. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. It's just a matter of time. The perfect example of this is Jesus. Philippians 2, 5 through 11. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, watch this, Jesus humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, what has God done? God has highly exalted Christ and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow. In heaven, on earth, and under the earth. Not leaving anybody out there. Okay? And every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Y'all, there is coming a day. There is coming a day when all will bow before this Jesus who was executed by wicked men but has now been exalted by the Father in heaven. Some will do so willingly because guess what? You've bowed the knee in this life. And when that time comes, you're going to eagerly, joyfully surrender it all to Jesus. In fact, all of the gifts, the crowns, the rewards that he hands to you, what are you going to do with them? Oh man, you're going to give them back. You're going to give them back. Because you're going to realize, Jesus, this is all about you. You did this through me. This has nothing to do with me. But there are going to be others. There are going to be others on that day who will bow because, like Haman, God has forced their hand. They wanted to live their lives their way for the extent of their lives. And when it all came down to it, they weren't willing and ready to acknowledge Christ's kingship. But it'll happen because guess what? Whether you are like it or not, Jesus is king.
Amen.
That's what God has appointed him. Isaiah 2:12 says this: for the Lord of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up, and it shall be brought low. Little did Haman know that his time was up when he entered the king's palace in the middle of the night to put an end to Mordecai. Little did he know that there was one actually more powerful than him at work in the world who would ultimately bring him to ruin rather than let him have his way. Folks, the time to surrender your life to Christ is not then, because then it'll be too late. The time to do it is when? Now. Do it now. Surrender your life, control of it over to Him, and find in Him the joy of being led by this gracious, humble, loving, sacrificial King. Psalm 2, verses 10 through 12 offer this invitation. Now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. There are no rulers in here. But if we're all honest, we like our little kingdoms and we like to be in control of our lives. To that the psalmist says, serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in Him. Outside of Jesus, there is death. Outside of Jesus, there is condemnation. Outside of Jesus, there is Haman, whose pride is put in its place by God. But inside of Christ, if you repent of your sin, if you decide today to place your whole life in His hands, in other words, if you surrender to Christ, the psalmist says that that's the way of blessing. That's the way of life. Life might not always be easy from that point on. In fact, I guarantee you it won't be. But you will have found refuge in Christ, who can help you weather all the storms you will face, and who will bring you all the way home to Him. Now, watching your kingdom crumble may seem like death, but the Bible promises that it's actually the doorway to life. So if you're here this morning and you have not bowed the knee to Jesus Christ, I want to invite you to do that. Did you know this King gave His life for you? This King gave His life that you might have life, that you might be forgiven of all your sin, that you might hear His welcome into His kingdom, that you might become a child of the Father, and that you might dwell in His house forever. And today the invitation stands open to any and all who will come. Come. Lay down your burdens. Lay down your self-assured life. Set aside your kingdom. Let it crumble. It may be hard, but you're going to get a better life. And if you're here today and you do know the Lord Jesus, I'm willing to bet that you're like me, and that there are areas of your life that you've not surrendered to Christ. There are areas of your life that you're trying hard to control. And you need to hear the first several verses of Esther. And you need to hear God say to you, child, I got this. I got this. Look, I can work through a king's insomnia, sleepless nights, reading phone books, chance encounters. I got this. May you hear that today, and may you go before the Father and seek fresh faith to trust Him. Let's pray as a worship.